On the 7th of June 1951, inside of Landsberg prison, a number of evil war criminals made their way to the gallows, and they were a collection of some of the Second World War's worst executioners. These were men who commanded the Einsatzgruppe, the Nazi paramilitary execution squads that followed the advances of the Wehrmacht. These men were commanding groups of firing squads inside of occupied lands, and they were responsible for the systematic slaughter of hundreds of thousands of men, women and children, if not millions. The Einsatzgruppe were known for their evil and ruthlessness. However, despite a few men being brought to justice, many of these executioners were never brought to the courtrooms. Today we look at the executions of those men who commanded the Einsatzgruppe and their individual stories within the Second World War. Each of these men were condemned for their crimes, and the majority of these occurred inside of the American-controlled prison of Landsberg. Join us today as we look at the executions of the commanders of the Einsatzgruppe, and as always, to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Werner Braune was born on the 11th of April 1909 inside of Meerstedt, and he had a rather normal early life, attending school, and he then studied at different universities, studying law and the theory of law. But in the 1930s, he was lured into the politics of the Nazi Party, like many people in Germany were, and he joined the Nazi Party at the age of 22 when he was still a student. But people like Werner Braune, who had a knowledge of law and politics, were seen of use by the Nazis, and in November 1931 he joined the SA, the Stormtroopers or the Brown Shirts as they were known. The SA were at this time seen as the bodyguards of Hitler, and they were also the strongest power in the early 1930s, until they were purged, with the SS being the ones who carried out this attack on Adolf Hitler's orders. Werner Braune joined the SS in November 1934, and he also worked for the security service known as the SD. Further work inside of police organisations such as the Gestapo continued for Braune, and he even became the Gestapo leader for the city of Münster. In this work he would be responsible for rounding up resistors and rounding up those who were dissenting to the Nazi regime and Hitler's policies. The Gestapo would brutally torture and deport people to concentration camps too, and this would have been the daily work of Braune. He was then transferred to become a Gestapo chief in more cities, but as the Second World War broke out, he became appointed as a commander of a horrific set of executioners known as the Einsatzgruppe. The Einsatzgruppe were a collection of SS executioners who would follow the advances of the Wehrmacht and the German army. They would round up people and civilians inside of villages and settlements, sort through these people, and then order huge numbers to go to the outskirts of the settlement. They would then be ordered to dig huge pits, which would become their graves. The people were led into these pits in small groups, where executioners armed with rifles on the edge of the pit would fire into them, instantly killing or seriously injuring. Then executioners would patrol the pit, offering further gunshots. Hundreds of thousands were slaughtered in this way, and Werner Braune was one of those people who was commanding large numbers of the execution squads. Braune specifically commanded Special Detachment 11B, which was part of Einsatzgruppe D. He organised and conducted the slaughter of Jews, Soviet commissars and others in the area known as Army Group South Rear Area, in this region. It was a systematic slaughter of huge numbers of people, and his brother would even be a commander inside of the death squads too. Specifically, under the command of Werner Braune, Special Detachment 11B carried out a huge massacre in which, in the Crimea, over the course of 3 days, his soldiers slaughtered and murdered 14,500 Jews. They slaughtered all day and all night, and Braune in September 1942, following being responsible for the deaths of thousands, returned to Halle, and he received a number of different promotions within the SS. He would finish the Second World War as the leader of the German Foreign Service Academy, and he was then dispatched to Norway to serve as a commander of the security police and the SD in the occupied land. But there were many different war criminals who who at the end of the Second World War tried to escape and evade any form of justice, and some lived under false papers and names to avoid detection and arrest. It's likely that Braune would have been advised to do this by Heinrich Himmler, who offered this advice to many different adjutants and SS friends and colleagues. But Braune was arrested at the end of the Second World War, and his legitimate identity was then discovered. He was then brought before what became known as the Einsatzgruppe trial, a series of proceedings against 22 former SS leaders who, as commanders of the death squads, took the responsibility for the crimes of those executioners. The indictments included the reports of over 1 million victims, and the court said in its judgment that, in this case, the defendants are not simply accused of planning or directing wholesale killings through channels. They are not charged with sitting in an office hundreds and thousands of miles away from the slaughter. It is asserted with particularity that these men were in the field, actively superintending, controlling, directing, and taking active part in the bloody harvest. Werner Braune, in front of the court, claimed that he was not responsible for the killings, and he said he was only acting upon the orders given to him by his SS superiors and those such as Heinrich Himmler. It was said of him that, in October 1941, he was assigned to Einsatzkommando 11B. As chief of this unit, Braune knew of the Führer order and executed it to a hilt. His defence is a general one of superior orders, which avails Braune no more than it does anyone else who executes a criminal order with the zeal that Braune brought to the Führer order. Various reports implicate Braune and his commando in the sordid business of illegal killing. The tribunal has already spoken of the Christmas massacre as Simferopol. Braune was the leader in charge of this operation. He has admitted responsibility for this murder in unequivocal language. On the 10th of April 1948, Braune was sentenced to death and he was sent to Landsberg prison to await his death sentence. He was on death row for over 3 years inside of the same prison that Adolf Hitler had earlier been incarcerated within. But on the 7th of June 1951, Braune was told it was his time to die, and he was led from his prison cell towards a courtyard where a large gallows could be found. He was accompanied by a priest and many military policemen that led him up to the gallows and then up the stairs. His arms and legs had been secured, but then he was handed over to the executioner. The executioner performed some final checks before placing the noose and black cap over his head, and Braune earlier had uttered his final words as he left his prison cell, and he was shouting, "Comrades, long live Germany." Following the final checks, he was then moved over the trapdoor, and was then released through the trap, and the rope went taut, and he was executed. Werner Braune was a brutal and ruthless executioner who had a long career inside of the SS. He was a man who would oversee the death squads, who performed the slaughter of thousands inside of German-occupied lands. He was one of a number of Einsatzgruppe commandos who were led up to the gallows that day, and he was a man who expressed little remorse for his crimes. At the age of 42 inside of Landsberg prison, the cruelty of Werner Braune came to an end. Erich Naumann was born on the 29th of April 1905 inside of Meissen in Saxony. It is presumed he had a rather normal upbringing, but his family would never have believed the brute he would become during the Second World War. When he was 16, Naumann left school, and he took a job inside of a local firm in his hometown. But at the end of the 1920s, Naumann, like thousands of other German people, would be lured in and attracted to the politics of Adolf Hitler and the Nazis. He was at the time in his mid-20s, and it would be within the Nazi organisations that later came to power and prominence in Germany that Naumann would go from a simple sales job to becoming a man who was in charge of death squads and executioners. In 1933 he joined the SA, the Brown Shirts or the Stormtroopers as they were known. The SA were considered the bodyguards of Adolf Hitler. They would often disrupt the meetings of political rivals and fight on the streets with those people the Nazis would persecute. They also attacked rival political parties and would cause chaos and disruption. Naumann was a member of these thuggish men, but at some point Hitler had become to get convinced that the SA were being too powerful. Some of his inner circle had played on his anxieties that he could be usurped by his friend, the head of the SA, Ernst Röhm, as many in the SA were more loyal to Rome than Hitler. But Hitler would order the Night of the Long Knives, a huge purge of the brown shirts, which resulted in many deaths and executions and large-scale arrests. Naumann survived this purge, and he, despite being a full-time member of the SA, had become an officer of the police and was a rather senior official in the group. But in 1935 he was moved across to the SD, the Sicherheitsdienst. This was the intelligence service of the SD, and Naumann was in a role in which he was now responsible for gathering information about the enemies of the Nazis, or those suspected of dissenting. They worked alongside the Gestapo and others, and the SD were brutal in their work. They would hunt down those who were being persecuted by the Nazis. He continued in this role for a number of years, and further promotions came for him inside of the SS, as he eventually rose to the rank of SS Brigadeführer. But his most horrific actions came during the Second World War, and specifically inside of lands that had been taken and seized by the German army. The Einsatzgruppe were the paramilitary death squad set up by the SS, and the Nazis would carry out the slaughter of millions of civilians, following advancements which were made by the Wehrmacht. After the German army pushed on, these executioners arrived, and they came to settlements all over occupied lands, and would sort the civilian population, and they then led people to the edge of the settlements, where they forced them at gunpoint to dig a huge pit, and this would become their graves. In smaller groups all day long, and sometimes for many days, groups of civilians would be led into the pits, and they would either be shot by the Einsatzgruppe executioners, who were stood on the edge of the pit, armed with their rifles. They could also be told to lie down on the corpses of those who went before. They would then be shot in the back of the head. It was mass slaughter on a huge scale. Erich Naumann was seen as a trusted member of the SS, and as soon as the Second World War broke out in Europe with the German invasion of Poland, Naumann was given command of the Einsatzgruppe 6. During the Polish campaign, his execution squad slaughtered over 6,000 people. His actions had led to the mass murder of members of the Polish elite, and many of these victims were former teachers, members of the clergy, actors, former officers, members of the intelligentsia, and activists. But this would just be the start of Erich Naumann's horrific work, as following his work in Poland he was made the chief of Einsatzgruppe B from November 1941, and he remained in this job until around March 1943. He was now overseeing more detachments of executioners and much more slaughter of civilians. Following the German invasion of the Soviet Union, known as Operation Barbarossa, the Einsatzgruppe went into overdrive, slaughtering hundreds of thousands, and Naumann reported to Adolf Eichmann in November 1941 that his men had been responsible for the deaths of 17,256 people in Smolensk. His Einsatzgruppe would mostly use gunshot to execute, but they also had other weapons at their disposal, and they used free gas vans to slaughter. In his own words, he used these to exterminate human beings, but the continued massacres led to further reports in which Naumann claimed that by December 1942, his men had executed 134,298 people. He was a man who would coordinate the massacres, and he was there witnessing it a lot of the time. He was not sat behind a desk thousands of miles away. He was often commanding the soldiers and telling them to shoot. The SS and Eichmann, along with Heinrich Himmler, were impressed by Naumann's ruthless work and his evil, and he was rewarded in September 1943 and was made the commander of the security police and SD in the occupied Netherlands. He would continue to be brutal in this role and kept up with executions and torture and used death squads to strike fear into the hearts of the Dutch people. But as the war turned against the Germans, there was a scramble by members of the SS and high-ranking members to try and save their own skin. Men like Erich Naumann knew that if they were caught, they would be tried by Allied nations for their horrific crimes, and Heinrich Himmler advised his top men to obtain false papers and false identities to try and live discreetly without detection. However, Erich Naumann was captured by the Allies, and his crimes would be told about to his interrogators, and with this he was brought to trial alongside many other high-ranking members of the Einsatzgruppe. Surprisingly, the Allies managed to have in their custody a large number of those men who coordinated the mass slaughter. It was said in the judgment that, in this case, the defendants are not simply accused of planning or directing wholesale killing through channels. They are not charged with sitting in an office hundreds and thousands of miles away from the slaughter. It is asserted with particularity that these men were in the field, actively superintending, controlling, directing, and taking an active part in the bloody harvest. The men on trial were accused of murdering over 1 million people, and Erich Naumann would claim at his trial that he did not consider his work and actions when he commanded the Einsatzgruppe to be wrong. He brazenly claimed that he was doing what he believed was sickeningly right for the Nazis, and specifically when asked if he perceived his work and Hitler's orders as being morally wrong, he claimed, "No, Your Honour, I consider the decree to be right, because it was our aim in our part of the war, therefore it was necessary." He claimed that he had been assigned to do a job of executing civilians en masse during the war, and he said he had no problems with doing this. He was asked by the courtroom for further information, and they said, "Then the tribunal will accept from your answer that you saw nothing wrong with your orders, and with the orders, even though it did involve the killing of defenceless human beings. This is what we draw from your answer." Erich Naumann just nodded to this and replied, "Yes, Your Honour." He accepted his work and was not guilty about the fact he is considered to have been responsible for the slaughter of at least 95,000 confirmed victims, and many dozens of thousands more. For his role in the Second World War in the SS, Erich Naumann was found guilty of crimes against humanity, war crimes, and membership of an illegal criminal organisation, the SD and the SS. He was sentenced to death and would be sent to Landsberg prison to await his execution, and he remained on death row for around 3 years. On the 7th of June 1951, shortly after midnight, Erich Naumann was told it was his time for his execution, and he left his prison cell accompanied by a number of American military policemen and a priest. He was led out into the courtyard of Landsberg prison, and there stood a large gallows. Naumann was led up the execution scaffold, and he was helped up the stairs, and his arms had been secured behind him by the executioner's assistant. When on top of the steps, the priest asked him for any final words, and he stepped back and let the executioner do his work. The executioner checked Naumann's arms and legs that they were secure, then shuffled him over the trapdoor, and a photograph was taken of him, looking rather pensive and also terrified, as he knew his death was coming. He then had a black cap placed over his head, and the executioner secured the noose, which was hung from the crossbeam. After final checks, the trapdoor was released, and instantly Erich Naumann was executed. He was one of the most despicable war criminals of the Second World War, and Erich Naumann had no remorse for the evil he had committed under the Nazis and the SS. He was a man who deemed his work to have been necessary, and he did not offer any apology or feeling of guilt for the slaughter he was part of, and he witnessed every single day. At the age of 46, the evil of Erich Naumann came to an end inside the walls of Landsberg prison. Otto Ohlendorf was born on the 4th of February 1907, and he grew up inside of a family of farmers. It's assumed that he had a rather normal upbringing, but when he was 18 he joined the Nazi Party, and was considered one of the earliest members. Thousands of younger people across Germany began to become attracted to the politics of Hitler and the Nazis, but Ohlendorf the following year joined the SS, and at this time they were not the paramilitary brutal force that they would later become. They were nowhere near as powerful as Hitler's brown shirt CSA. But in the years following, Ohlendorf went to university and studied economics and law, and he also became a doctor of law, and men who had this amount of knowledge, who were also Nazis, would be seen as useful by Hitler. But Ohlendorf threw himself into the Nazi Party's regime as their power over Germany increased, and he taught in Nazi schools in Berlin. He was seen as a good lawyer, who often intervened with debates between the SS and other organisations, and in 1937 he joined the SD, the intelligence service of the SS. It was his job to help in the arrest and roundup of those men and women who opposed Hitler, and specifically he was involved in the economic side of the organisation. But Otto Ohlendorf continued to rise throughout the ranks of the SS, and he did gain a number of senior positions and promotions, but he would upset a number of people, and he worked to collect intelligence from secret agents, and some in the Nazi Party disliked his work. This included the head of the SS, Heinrich Himmler, who once described Otto Ohlendorf as an unbearable Prussian who had no sense of humour. But he was a powerful man inside of the SD, and he continued to carry on the brutal work of the Nazi Party, especially as the persecution of people ramped up across the nation. However, as the Second World War raged across Europe, Ohlendorf was recruited by the head of the SD, Reinhard Heydrich, to carry out a role in which he would be incredibly ruthless and brutal. The man who would be happy sitting behind a desk a lot of the time would now be on the front lines of the Second World War, arranging execution squads, which were known as the Einsatzgruppe. Heydrich appointed Ohlendorf to become the commander of Einsatzgruppe D, and these saw action in the region of the Crimea. The Einsatzgruppe were the horrific death squads that followed the advances of the German army. These SS executioners would round up civilians in a settlement or a small town. They would then sort through the population, then lead those who were to be executed to the edge of a town or a concealed area. Here these people were forced to dig huge pits which would become their graves, and in small groups the civilians were led into the pits, where the executioners would stand on the edge, aiming their rifles at them, then take a fatal shot. Others were led into the pits and were told to lie on the corpses of those before an executioner administered a shot in the back of their necks. It was cold-blooded slaughter, and the Einsatzgruppe were responsible for the slaughter of millions. Ohlendorf's executioners, specifically Einsatzgruppe D, were the smallest of the forces, but they were helped out in their murderous actions by men from other nations, and they continued their slaughter throughout different Soviet lands. His men were attached to the 11th Army. They would follow their advances, and his group were responsible for a massacre in December 1941 at Simferopol, which resulted in over 14,000 people's deaths. In this region where he operated, over 90,000 people were killed by his actions and his unit. Ohlendorf himself did not like the use of the shot of the back of the neck, and he would prefer to order his execution squads to shoot like a normal firing squad from a distance, so that the executioners did not accept as much responsibility for their actions. He banned any contact between the firing squads and the victims, and as many as 3 executioners with their rifles were to shoot one person. He also told his men not to steal any of the victims' property, and instigated a military-style execution to the proceedings, and it was one of his executioners that said, "A man is the lord over life and death when he gets an order to shoot 300 children, and he kills at least 150 himself." Otto Ohlendorf was there on the front lines, and he was there witnessing the killing. He was approached by Himmler to use gas fans to slaughter people too, but Ohlendorf stated that his men refused to use them, as they found burying the victims too much after. He saw these as impractical, and said that it would take too long to kill, but Otto Ohlendorf was a man who was incredibly devoted to the Nazi cause, and he never complained once about the murderous actions. He did, though, once complain about the actions of some of the other soldiers from other nations he was overseeing in his death squads, who were committing scores of atrocities as well as being the executioners. But as well as being responsible for the slaughter squads, Ohlendorf also had other jobs, such as being the Deputy Director General for the Reich Ministry of Economic Affairs. He was seen as a man who would be of use by Hitler, and he even made plans for the future of Germany when he believed the war would be won. However, as the war turned against the Germans, it was clear to Himmler and high-ranking SS members that one day they would be hunted for being barbaric war criminals. Himmler instructed those close to him to obtain false papers and assume new identities, but Ohlendorf was involved in Heinrich Himmler's flight to Flensburg, and he actually was arrested by the British in May 1945, and shortly after this Heinrich Himmler would take his own life after his capture. Ohlendorf was interrogated, and he would during these interviews tell of the horrific actions of the German army in the east, and he was later brought to the Einsatzgruppe trial. The court proceedings tried to punish those men who were the commanders and leaders inside of the Einsatzgruppe, and they were said to have been responsible for the murders of over 1 million people. Otto Ohlendorf was seen as one of the most powerful defendants, and he was the chief defendant. He also gave evidence that was used against the other war criminals, and was said to have been a reliable source of information. He was a devout Nazi, but he was a man who hated corruption, and he had a strong commitment to his duty. During his trial he claimed that he was a loyal Nazi, and he admitted that he acted properly, and what he had done was not wrong at all. He had no remorse for his actions, and he believed the slaughter he oversaw was justified. Later the prosecutor involved in his trial would outline Ohlendorf's comments, and he said, when Ohlendorf was asked to verify that his unit had murdered 90,000 Jews, the SS general began to quibble. He said he could not confirm it. The reason given was that sometimes his men exaggerated the body count. Would the general care to venture an estimate? No. Was it perhaps 80,000 or over 70,000? That was possible. Or perhaps 100,000? Maybe. And were there many Jewish children amongst those who were killed? Yes, of course. But, added Ohlendorf, he never allowed his men to do as some other units did. He told his men never to use infants for target practice, nor smash their heads against a tree. He ordered his men to allow the mother to hold her infant to her breast and to aim for her heart. That would avoid screaming, and would allow the shooter to kill both mother and child with one bullet. It saved ammunition. Ohlendorf said he refused to use the gas vans that were assigned to his companies. He found that when the mobile killing vehicles arrived at their destination, when they were supposed to dump their asphyxiated corpse into a waiting ditch, some of the captives were still alive and had to be unloaded by hand. His troops had to drag out corpses amid vomit and excrement, and that was very hard on his men, Ohlendorf claimed. At the trial, he tried to state that the actions of the Einsatzgruppe were aimed at securing the newly occupied areas, and he claimed it was necessary to make sure that the occupations of these regions went smoothly. But this did not win over the court, and he said that his firing squads were no worse than the press-button killers who dropped the atom bomb on Japan. But for his actions, Otto Ohlendorf was sentenced to death in April 1948. He was transferred to Landsberg prison to await his execution, and he spent 3 years behind bars before it was time for his date with the executioner. On the 7th of June 1951, he was led out to his prison cell and was accompanied by American military policemen and also a priest, who was there to give him spiritual guidance in his final moments. It was just past midnight, and Ohlendorf was led up to the gallows in the courtyard, and he was then helped up the stairs of the execution device and structure after he had his legs and arms secured behind his back. The executioner, whilst he was on the scaffold, checked some parts of the execution process and then shuffled him over the trapdoor, and then a photographer took a final image of Otto Ohlendorf with the executioner and his assistant, and it showed him looking straight at the camera, being very pensive, and he did not appear to show much remorse. The executioner then placed a black cap over his head and then the noose. This was secured, then the trapdoor was released, and instantly Otto Ohlendorf was executed, and he was then placed inside of a coffin after his death was confirmed. Otto Ohlendorf was responsible for the executions of around 95,000 people, and his actions were horrific and ruthless. He had no regard for the men, women and children who the Einsatzgruppe under his command slaughtered, and his crimes were carried out across much of the Eastern Front. He was sentenced to death for his actions following his trial, and at the age of 44 inside of Landsberg prison on the gallows, Otto Ohlendorf's life came to an end. Friedrich Jeckeln was born in February 1895, and not much is known about his early life. But he was involved in the First World War, and would also rise to the rank of an officer before the conflict ended with the German defeat. Following the First World War, there was a difficult time emerging inside of Germany, as they were forced to undergo years of struggle and issues, especially following the Wall Street crash, which pushed many Germans towards poverty and starvation. But because of this, a number of political parties which were radical emerged, such as the Nazi Party. In the post-war Germany, Jeckeln worked as an engineer before he joined officially the Nazis in 1929, and he then 2 years later became a member of the SS. He served as an officer, and eventually also was an elected member of the Reichstag, but Jeckeln rose to the rank of an Obergruppenführer in the SS. Jeckeln was a man who was known for his toughness and barbaric side, and he was someone who would ruthlessly want to stamp the Nazis' authority on Germany, and he even at times murdered the political opponents of the Nazis. He was involved in the Rieseberg murders, which resulted in the slaughter of 11 communists. However, during the Second World War, this barbaric Nazi would be thrust into the deadliest conflict in history, and he would become an even more terrible criminal. He was drafted into the Waffen-SS, and he served as an officer inside of Regiment 2 of the Death's Head Division, and was then transferred by Heinrich Himmler to become a higher SS and police leader on the Eastern Front in the Soviet Union. But when he served in this senior position, Friedrich Jeckeln oversaw the executions and slaughter of thousands of innocent people. He was in control of all of the SS Einsatzgruppe divisions in his district, and the operations they got involved in, carrying out scores of massacres. The Einsatzgruppe were the executioners and death squads who followed the advances of the German military, They would round up civilians in terrible mass killings. They would enter a village and settlement, and then order the civilians to come out. They were then told to dig large pits in concealed areas or on the edge of the settlements. Following this in small groups, civilians and victims would be led into the pits and then executed. The true crimes of these killers still lie today under the earth, and many of these massacres are still undiscovered. But Jeckeln continued to oversee the actions of the Einsatzgruppe, and the group were responsible for the slaughter of around 2 million people. But within the Soviet Union, the killing squads were dispatched to kill specifically those being persecuted by the Nazis, and also those related to communism or the Communist Party. With this, huge acts of slaughter continued, and Jeckeln oversaw large massacres, and word began to spread about the horrific slaughter which was taking place all across the Soviet Union. Many people tried to flee, but specific instruction was given to commanders such as Jeckeln to continue the executions at all cost. Within weeks of Operation Barbarossa being launched, huge pogroms were launched, which led to the deaths of 10,000 people, and Jeckeln developed a system of mass killing, in which he believed was the most efficient way, and it was known as the Jeckeln system. This process was as followed. The SD would firstly force people out of their homes, and then they would sort through those who were scheduled for execution, sorting people into lines of 500 to 1,000 people. Then after this, the victims were taken to the execution site. The order police led these columns of people to the massacre pits, and at least 3 pits would be dug in advance. The victims, when they arrived at their site of death, would be forced to take off their clothes, and also valuables, which were placed in different piles for sorting. They were then forced to run past many guards, being driven into the pits before they were ordered to lie down on top of the bodies of previously executed victims. Then the executioners would fire into the victims, and they even used Russian guns to hide their crimes and to save on the cost of bullets, and these murderers then walked inside of the trenches, performing further coup de grace gunshots if someone had somehow survived. If someone did survive, they could even be buried alive under the bodies of many more. One of the most horrific acts that Friedrich Jeckeln was involved in was the Rumbula massacre, which occurred between the 30th of November 1941 and the 8th of December. Close to Riga, in the Rumbula forest, around 25,000 Jews were slaughtered by the Einsatzgruppe A, and there was a lot of planning that went into this attack. Jeckeln himself had researched different areas in the region to carry out the large-scale killings, and he employed his own bodyguards to carry out the attack. The executioners fired upon the victims from the edge of the pits, and in larger ones they walked amongst the dead, administering gunshots. Jeckeln was noted to have been stood overseeing proceedings at the top, and he gave the instructions to his executioners. On the first day, 13,000 people had been shot. Many were claimed to have been half dead when they were shot, but further execution occurred. He also oversaw the Babi Yar massacre, in which thousands more were slaughtered. It was said of this that, although only approximately 5,000 to 6,000 Jews had been expected at first, more than 30,000 arrived, who until the very moment of their execution still believed in resettlement, thanks to a very clever organisation. Friedrich Jeckeln had become one of the SS's most brutal and ruthless commanders, and he was responsible for dozens of thousands of civilian deaths. He was not fighting armed enemy combatants with this, but instead slaughtering unarmed civilians. As the Second World War came to an end, he continued to rampage throughout different lands, but he was captured by the Red Army close to Halba in Germany on the 28th of April 1945. He was identified and was in 1946 taken to trial in Riga, close to where he committed scores of atrocities. Jeckeln was brought alongside 7 others, and it was clear to the prosecution what he had done. But throughout his trial it was revealed that he was present at most of the large-scale shootings and massacres, and he even shot people himself with his weapons. Further slaughter stories came out, and it was said he was responsible for at least 100,000 people's deaths and executions. Friedrich Jeckeln tried to say he was just following orders given to him by Heinrich Himmler, however he was sentenced to death. On the 3rd of February 1946, the barbaric Einsatzgruppe commander was taken from his prison cell to Victory Square in Riga, alongside other defendants who had been condemned to death. There was a large crowd that day that had gathered to witness the executions of those senior German officers who had caused so much death and destruction. Stalin ordered that many of these war criminals should be executed in front of large crowds of Soviet people, as he wanted to make sure his justice was being seen. But Friedrich Jeckeln was brought to the specially built gallows, and he was led up to the noose where he was to be hanged. He was ordered to stand on the back of a truck, which was reversed under the gallows, and an executioner then secured the noose around his neck. The death sentence was read out, and then following this, the truck drove off, and the rope around Jeckeln's neck snapped taut, and with this he was left hanging on the gallows. He was a ruthless and barbaric executioner and leader of death squads, but Friedrich Jeckeln paid for his crimes with his life in public, in front of a crowd of around 4,000. He was a man who oversaw the horrific slaughter of the Einsatzgruppe, and his victims would tell the courtroom at his trial about his actions and the work of his men. One particular harrowing quote from a victim told of his evil, and a survivor of the Rumbula massacre said, "A mountain of footwear was pressing down on me. My body was numb from cold and immobility. However, I was fully conscious. The snow under me had melted from the heat of my body. Quiet for a while. Then from the direction, a child's cry, 'Mama, mama, mama,' a few shots, quiet, killed." It was Friedrich Jeckeln who led this sort of slaughter. Paul Blobel was born in August 1894 in Potsdam, and following schooling he worked as a mason and a carpenter. But as the First World War broke out across Europe, he worked as a carpenter and joined up with the German army, and served as an engineer close to the front lines. Blobel received a number of promotions, but at the end of the conflict he remained unemployed in Germany, but studied to become an architect. Following the Wall Street crash, he found himself yet again unemployed, and in December 1931, Paul Blobel joined the Nazi Party, the SA, and also the SS. Hitler and his party had promised to restore German pride and to provide the German people with jobs when people were suffering heavily. In 1933, Blobel then joined up with the local police in Dusseldorf, and he was recruited to be an agent in the SD, the intelligence service. But as the Second World War erupted, with the invasion of Poland in September 1939, he was then serving in the SS. The Germans, however, in June 1941 invaded the Soviet Union, and Hitler wanted to take large amounts of land, and his forces rampaged across towards the east. But Paul Blobel then became the chief of Sonderkommando Unit 4A, and he was attached to Einsatzgruppe C. His forces served in Nazi-occupied Ukraine, and as the Wehrmacht advanced to take more land and territory, the Einsatzgruppe, as mentioned, would then arrive and round up civilians and Jews who would then be executed. The executioners would force victims to dig huge pits and graves on the edge of settlements, and they would then in small groups march them into the pits, where they were shot by firing squads stood on the edge. Also, individual executioners, armed with pistols, were ready to offer gunshots to the back of the neck inside of the pit too. Blobel, inside of the lands he was overseeing, was put to work establishing a ghetto in the city of Zitomir, and this forced Jews, around 3,000 of them, into a small cramped area before they would then be executed a month later. He was ordered to exterminate the entire Jewish population of the country, and on the 22nd of August 1941 he took part in the Bila Tserkva massacre. This was a huge war crime in which the entire adult population of the town was slaughtered by Blobel's Einsatzgruppe, but Blobel even ordered collections of children to be massacred. Blobel was one of the men who gave this specific order, but he continued to slaughter wherever he went. In September 1941 he was involved in organising the Babi Yar massacre, in which, in a ravine near to Kiev, the Einsatzgruppe massacred around 33,000 Jews. Further slaughter continued, but the Einsatzgruppe were commanded by Blobel, and he even received praise by the SS hierarchy for his actions. However, Blobel was sacked, as he was regarded as a drunk, and it was said he was unfit to continue his role leading the execution squads. But after losing his command of the Einsatzgruppe, he was then given a different role, but one which was very important to the Nazis. He oversaw Action 1005, a group that were tasked with covering up and hiding Nazi war crimes, concealing the mass murder of civilians, and Blobel even experimented with the best way of hiding and getting rid of human bodies. He even tried to destroy corpses in forests using incendiary bombs, and his group exhumed en masse the remains of many, and then burned them in huge pyres. Paul Blobel was proud of what he did during the Second World War, and he said of his crimes, "Here lie my 30,000 Jews, near to the site of the Babi Yar massacre." But at the end of the Second World War, he was brought to the Einsatzgruppe trial. Alongside him in the courtroom sat many other commanders of the Nazi death squads. It was said of the trial that it is asserted with particularity that these men were in the field actively superintending, controlling, directing, and taking an active part in the bloody harvest. There were 3 different charges: crimes against humanity, being a member of a criminal organisation, and also war crimes, and Blobel claimed in his testimony and evidence that he was responsible for around 10 to 15,000 deaths. However, the courtroom put forward evidence that he was actually responsible for around 60,000 deaths. He gave detailed accounts of his executions, and in particular what he participated in and ordered at the Babi Yar massacre. But for his crimes he was sentenced to death after being found guilty. It was said by the courtroom that a crime of such unprecedented brutality and of such inconceivable savagery that the mind rebels against its own thought, image, and the imagination staggers in the contemplation of a human degradation beyond the power of language to adequately portray. The number of deaths resulting from the activities with these defendants have been connected, and which the prosecution has set at 1 million, is an abstract number. One cannot grasp the full cumulative terror of murder 1 million times repeated. But Paul Blobel was sent to Landsberg prison to await his execution, and he was on the 7th of June 1951 told about his execution. He was informed shortly before midnight that his execution was to occur imminently, and he was then led out of the prison cell and into the courtyard. Accompanying him were many different members of the American military police, and also a priest who was there to offer him spiritual guidance in his final moments. Blobel was led to the gallows, and his legs had been secured, and then he was helped up the stairs, and his identity was confirmed. He was then handed over to the executioner, who placed the black cap over his head before he was then shuffled over the trapdoor, and the noose was then secured too. After all final checks were performed, the executioner released the trapdoor, and Paul Blobel plunged straight through. After this, his body was then placed inside of a coffin. Paul Blobel was executed alongside a number of horrific Einsatzgruppe commanders, and those men who were responsible for the slaughter of thousands of innocent people during the Second World War. He was a man who was even employed in covering up the Nazi war crimes, and he was someone who seemingly was trusted inside of Himmler's SS, but he was a man responsible for the deaths of around 60,000 people in cold blood. His victims were not soldiers armed with weapons. They were simply innocent men, women and children who were marched into the death pits and then were ruthlessly and horrifically cut down where they stood, usually very close to where they lived. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.